Hello, everyone. Uh, it's so nice to be back at a Melbourne Ruby meet. I've been away too long. I want to start by acknowledging that we are currently on the land of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation. Stolen land called Melbourne for the past 200 or so years, but known as Naarm for tens of thousands of years. I pay my respects to, oh, quickly. I pay my respects to Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung elders, past and present, and thank them for their ongoing care of culture, people, land, and water. I also want to note that we live in challenging times, from regular layoffs and cost of living challenges to genocide and famine and the growing impacts of climate change. If you are impacted by any of this in any way, I'm sorry. I hope you're going okay, and I hope that we can collectively make or help make things better. I realize that for many of us, code can be an escape from the broader world, and that's fun. But I encourage all of us to keep in mind the broader context of that world in which we work and we play, and be mindful of how we connect with others. For those of you who I've not yet had the pleasure to meet, my name is Pat. I've been coding with Ruby for a long time. I am trying not to count anymore. And I am a staff engineer at Covidence, where we build tools to help researchers conduct scientific reviews. The links here are my personal blog, Covidence's website, and my Mastodon account. In case any of that's of interest, I wouldn't stress too much about it. And I'm going to be talking about how we at Covidence have approached SSO and SAML using Ruby and Rails. Now, we've done that work together. It's very much a team effort. I just happen to be the person on stage today. So definitely don't give me all the credit. Now, I realize there's going to be a lot of jargon and terminology in this talk. So I'm going to start with a very basic overview, and then we'll go through some of the terms in more detail. I also should note that I'm going to publish these slides and other relevant links to the Ruby Australia Slack after this talk. And of course, there's a video going to be released as well. And I'll probably turn some of this into blog posts too, which is all to say, if something doesn't quite sit right, don't worry about it. You'll have another chance to go over things if you need to. But if you want to take notes as you go, that's also fine. So I'm going to start with the most pressing term, SSO. So SSO stands for single sign-on, which is the process of delegating authentication to a third-party service. And I suspect, even if we don't know the term, we've come across this process at some point online. It's quite common. You're viewing a website, you need to sign in, and it gives you the option of authenticating via Google or GitHub or Facebook or once upon a time Twitter. And you click that link, you're redirected off to the third-party site to sign in. You do that, and they send you back to the original site where you are logged in there too, perhaps with a new account if you hadn't done that before. And yeah, that process, that's SSO. SSO is kind of the catch-all term for that process. But my talk title actually referred to SAML. What is that? Well, I'll work through some terminology and we'll get to that one as we go, because there's a lot. So firstly, let's start with two words that are often mistakenly used interchangeably: authentication and authorization. Authentication is the process of confirming who someone is, right? Commonly done with a username and password. But authorization is checking whether someone has access to do certain things. what role do they have or permissions do they have? So there's a distinction between me being logged into a site, authentication, and me having admin access to manage other people's account. That would require authorization. Now, this talk is focused on authentication, which is finding the identity of someone, not authorization. I'm hopeful that I won't get it wrong through the rest of this talk. Not making any promises. Maybe you can heckle if you spot me making the mistake. That's totally fair. Okay, so SSO versus SAML. Let's come back to that one. What is SAML? SAML is the security assertion markup language. You can see why people just call it SAML. It is a standardized protocol for SSO. It's a particular way to ask a third-party site who a person is. Now, there are other protocols. You may have heard of OAuth. It's quite common. OIDC is another one. I'm sure there are more. I've not had to deal with them, which is nice. And in this talk, I'm focusing on SAML, though I'm sure some of the concepts apply more broadly. IDPs, another bit of terminology here. IDPs are identity providers. When you're going back and forth between these sites, there are services which confirm the identity of the user. This is generally where you're actually putting the password in. That's your IDP. That's your identity provider. It is saying, this is the identity of this person. So that often is Google or GitHub, or if you work for a large institution, they may have their own. And then on the other side of the fence are the service providers. SPs, I guess, but doesn't really roll off the tongue so neatly that way. The service provider is the site that redirects you to the identity provider. So it's probably the site that you're wanting to use that's asking you to then log in somewhere else. Essentially, it's the site that's providing the service that you want to use. So in the context of this talk, I'm focused on how a Rails or a Ruby app can act as the service provider. Because there are enough IDPs out there, essentially. It's also what we need to do at work. And to come back to the name of my talk, what makes me happy when I'm coding is that I have code that is clear, that is performant, and that is easy to test, especially easy to test. And that is both in an automated test suite and by a human using a browser. So what can this kind of happy situation look like when we're using and developing SAML? You could use a third-party intermediary, tools like Auth0, Shibboleth, Firebase, Kinder, Keycloak, Fusion Auth. There's a lot more out there. I had to do a bunch of research to decide how we would, what approach we would take. So you don't lack for options. Some of these are paid services. Some are open source. Some aren't open source, but are still free. And look, perhaps there's one that fits what you need. Brilliant, go for it. In our case, there wasn't. Well, mostly wasn't. With confidence, many of our customers are large institutions, often universities, and they have their own identity providers. Hence why us providing SSO was actually useful to them. But these institutions are also part of federations, which are directories of identity providers from many, many institutions, dozens, hundreds, maybe, often grouped by country. So these federations have their own layer of protocol over the top of SAML, and we needed to work with that extra layer. So the third parties that I listed before, mostly they don't support that. Shibboleth being the one exception, but Shibboleth is a Java app, which is fine. I'm not hating on Java. It's just that we didn't have the skills. Me and my colleagues didn't have that much experience with Java. We'd have to figure out how to integrate it with our Rails app. We'd have to figure out how to host it, how to test it. No, don't have time for that. We've got enough to learn about SAML itself without adding in a whole other language. So instead, we chose to implement the service provider logic in our Rails app directly. And this was greatly aided by two key things. Firstly, there's a Ruby SAML gem, which is built for this purpose. Brilliant, excellent. It's been around a long time and it has extensive tests. Like a lot of different IDPs do like the core stuff probably the same, but do other little bits and pieces slightly differently, just a little bit different. And this gem's been around so long that it can probably handle all of those idiosyncrasies. So that's nice. And then there was a service called Osso. Osso was a third-party paid intermediary, much like Auth0 or Firebase or Kinder. They no longer exist, which is sad. But back when they were running, they wrote a blog post on how you can build service provider logic in a Rails app. Essentially exactly what we needed to do. And it was a curious move by them because they were essentially saying, hey, look, we've built this thing. You should use this thing. It's great. If you want to build it yourself, we'll tell you how. But you see, it's a lot, right? So you should still use our thing. Now that's brave and commendable. I don't think that's why the company doesn't exist anymore. But their blog post still exists out there. So that's very nice and very useful. So between that blog post and the Ruby SAML gem and its documentation, it wasn't too daunting to actually do this ourselves instead of using a third party. So now is probably good time to admit that I'm not going to share all the code because there's a fair bit and I get lost in it. Maybe I shouldn't presume that you'll all get lost in it. I certainly do. But also a lot of our code has implementation specific to Confidence, and I probably shouldn't share that. And also it just wouldn't help with you all understanding things. So I'm going to show you bits and pieces as we go. And when I get around to turning it into blog posts, I'll try and make it as generic and useful as possible. But hopefully I at least give you the gist of things. Yeah, so as a service provider, all you really need to do at a minimum is two endpoints, two controller actions in a Rails app. One that sends you off to the identity provider saying, hey, I've got this person who needs to log in. And then one that takes the request that comes back from the identity provider saying, hey, we've got this person, you can trust them. So they're going out, they're coming back. So here is the first of those. I figure new and create as kind of a RESTful pair work pretty well in that regard. So here is the new action, which is all about sending you out to the IDP. There's not too much going on here, thankfully. We create a SAML request, and then we use that SAML request to generate a URL that we're sending you off to. And that's kind of it. I will note the relay state parameter is kind of just a bit of data that you care about. You send it to the IDP and it sends it back to you at the other end of the request. It doesn't do anything with it. It's kind of your state object if you need to kind of go, oh, I've had a request come back. Which request was that? And the relay state can be used to kind of help you figure out what's going on. So you'll see references to it as we go. It's not that big a deal. And the IDP won't try and parse it. It won't try and do anything with it beyond give it back to you at the end of the process. The other thing I will note is we've got this SAML settings method. What's that? Well, here is again a pretty simplified version, but this kind of sets up everything the Ruby SAML gem needs to know about your IDP and about you, and so how you can talk together. There are a lot more settings than what I'm showing you here. It's going to depend on the IDP, but this is kind of the core of it. So the first thing you need to do is tell the IDP where they should send the request back to once that person has authenticated. Where are you coming back to this app, the service provider? So this is going to be the create action that we'll get to in a moment. There's also a pair of entity IDs. Entity IDs are essentially unique identifiers. One for your service, which you will probably define, and one for the IDP, which they will certainly define. Entity IDs are often URLs, but they are not always URLs. They do not have to be URLs. But a lot of IDPs will use URLs as their entity IDs. The IDP will also give us the URL, the generic URL that we're sending people off to. And they will give us a certificate, which is how they sign requests, or you use it to sign a request going to them. Yeah, it's something along those lines. It gets a bit messy because there are multiple certificates sometimes involved. I'll get more into that a little bit. But that's kind of the core of what you need to say, hey, I'm dealing with this IDP. This is how we do it. And then here is a create action, which comes in as a post request. Hence, we need to not care about Rails authenticity tokens in this case, because it's not coming from your app, it's coming from the IDP. So we take in the SAML response and we tell it what settings we're dealing with, the same settings object we just created. And we say, hey, is this response actually valid? Cool. We've got an identity. What do we want to do with it? Probably sign that person in, but it could be something else. Depends on what your app's doing. That's a very simplistic example of what you may want to do. If you're using Devise or Clearance or some other gem for your user management, then they've probably got some docs on this is how you sign somebody in, so you can use that. Yeah, and if it's not valid, then you probably want to display an error to the user saying, hey, this doesn't look right. Either try again or do something different. Yeah, that's kind of that's the core of dealing with a SAML back and forth. I don't think it's too daunting, but I've been working with SAML stuff for the last several months, so it sits in my head a bit easier, I guess. So yeah, I talked about where are we? I talked about wanting things to be clear. They're clear to me. I hope they're somewhat clear to you, but clear is very much subjective, so don't sweat it if you're like, Pat, I really don't know what you're talking about. That's more on me. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Why would you choose SAML?
Sure. I know I'm using Google as a common example here, and that would, if it's with your like a personal account, then it's probably using OAuth. But if you have an organizational account, that like, you know, you work for a company and they have everybody in Google kind of thing, then SAML kind of can work at that level of like, you would configure it for the organization. So it's much more a business to business kind of setup rather than a personal setup.
Right. Or either way, you can also have a Google account, like some sort of account in your organization, you can generate the keyword instead of using the.
For some things, yeah. Okay, so clear-ish, but performant, yeah, look, mostly it was fine. It is fine. But we found one performance bottleneck, which wasn't in SAML itself, but rather in the federated data that we're relying on for many of our customers. So the federations tell you about all the IDPs that are part of them in a massive XML file. And that's great. No shame on XML. But interrogating that file can be a bit tricky. Ruby SAML gives us some tooling on how to do that. It's like, okay, we want just like from the metadata file, we want just this IDP with this entity ID. So then it can read the certificate, it can read the other URLs, it can read all the settings it needs to then talk to the IDP. So us setting up our SAML settings becomes much simpler, which is nice. The catch is that it's quite slow, especially for large files. It's also very memory hungry because as far as I could tell, it was loading up the entire XML file into Ruby objects, even though you just wanted one of them. I just want one IDP, just one IDP. Here's hundreds, great, but I just one. And then we dug a bit further, and we found that the Ruby SAML gem uses both RxML and Nokogiri. These are both gems that are for XML parsing. They do pretty much the same thing. Why both? I think at some point they went, oh, we should probably switch. And they started switching and they didn't finish switching. So some parts of it use RxML and some parts of it use Nokogiri. I think we've all worked on projects like that. It's understandable. Other priorities come up. Anyway, this parsing uses RxML. And so I tried writing the same kind of thing in Nokogiri. And it turns out much faster, much better. So this is that code. I don't think you need to pay too much attention to it because the chances of you dealing with federated IDPs is hopefully small for your sake. But I'll probably I will put this online somewhere. I don't have any benchmarks. Sorry, you'll just have to take my word that it's better. Also, maybe at some point we'll get around to contributing a patch back into Ruby SAML, because that would be nice. That would be polite. That would be a very nice way of doing things. Other priorities have come up, so hopefully we'll get to it. But, you know, just in the way they started a migration and they didn't finish, we started doing things and we've been distracted elsewhere too. That's fine. That's life. Anyway, it's clear enough. It's performant enough. Is it testable? Well, in our development workflows at Covidence, we have two key ways to manually test our work. I mean, three, I guess, because development environment, forgot that one. We have a staging environment, and we have PR apps, pull request apps. So these are ephemeral apps deployed for every active pull request. So you can test out the changes before merging it in. Now, oh, I skipped the whole thing. Yes. Using SSO on a staging app, using SAML on a staging app has been pretty easy. We configure it as a separate service provider, use those different details in the settings object, and we're good. It's fine. But PR apps have proven to be more difficult. In our experience, all identity providers we've worked with require a specific fixed URL to send SAML responses back to, that create action that we were doing before. It must be accessible on a known URL. You can't, when kicking off a request, go, oh, actually this time, can you go back over there instead of over here? You can't do that. They don't like it. which from a security perspective makes sense. Yep.
You think this that will do need to connect there are many kinds of tests.
Yes.
What was your goal?
That we could be as close to a production environment in our test apps, and then I'll get on to automated tests as well later on. Yeah, yeah. That's always, I think, the goal end to end. Sometimes there are things that get in the way of that. So to help with those, what I'm just discussing, the staging, clearly these are not real URLs, but staging is always accessible at the same URL. So having a SAML response go back to that's fine. But every time we create a new PR, we get a new domain, and we don't want to configure a different IDP connection for every single one. Indeed, you can't do that with Google in an automated sense. They don't have an API for it. So that would be painful. And we like to what you raised before, we really want the same experience as much as possible as what we're dealing with in production. So we want to use SSO in production. We want to use SSO on our PR apps. And yes, identity providers don't allow you to specify, say, a pattern of like anything with a subdomain looking kind of like this. No good. It's very strict. So instead, please bear with my very basic diagrams here. We're using our staging server as a bridge, because our staging server essentially can operate as an IDP as well. And it can be flexible about the URLs that it sends back to because we control it. So the PR app still functions as a service provider. That's great. The staging app is both an identity provider for requests coming from the PR apps, and then it's a service provider sending the request on to the actual IDP, which in our case is often Google for our company-wide testing. And then you enter in your details, you get sent back to staging, and staging immediately sends you back to the PR app. Kind of essentially wrapping and unwrapping the SAML details back and forth. Yes.
That staging server seems pretty interesting. Did you have to write that yourself, or is it something SAML as a protocol actually allows for?
Had to write it ourselves. Mate, if it's something that SAML actually allows for, I'm going to be very annoyed that I've done all this work. But I'm going to show you some code on how we go about that. But yeah, just from a user's perspective, you're on the PR app, you're on the IDP, you're on the PR app. It goes through staging. You'd have to be keeping a close eye on the URL bar to actually see that happening because it's such a fleeting kind of transition. You're not seeing any like HTML on the staging side. So the code, again, simplified. That there's like that save identity cache method does a bit that I'm sure is useful. Am I going to show that to you right now? No, I'm not. Will I try and put it in a blog post? Yes, I will. So again, this is the code that the staging server runs. And again, we have a new and a create. A new for a request that's coming from the PR app that you want to send on to the actual IDP. And we'll get to the create action in a sec. The reason, oh no, I'm going to talk about the identity cache stuff later. I'll get to that. But yeah, we've got a request coming in. We're redirecting you straight back out again, off to the IDP. And then our create action is kind of setting up you get a SAML response, and then you're sending on a new SAML response back to the PR app. Now this is a two-parter. This is kind of setting up a bunch of instance variables, and then it actually renders some HTML, which is mostly just Ruby here, and then a little bit of JavaScript. So essentially, it's rendering a form and submitting it straight away because it has to be a post request. So we can't redirect. Little bit annoying like that, but that's fine. So it's just some hidden fields, a form that submits straight away, sends you on your way back to the PR app. Yeah, as I said, I'm going to publish a lot of this code in a more useful sense after the talk. One thing okay, yeah. So here are the things I want to highlight as part of this process. There is a SAML IDP gem. I know we've had a Ruby SAML gem. That's for service provider kind of stuff. SAML IDP gem is for IDP kind of stuff, identity provider stuff. Look, I'll be honest, I don't love this gem. I had to really read through the source code to figure out how to use it. But also we're using it in a way that's probably not the standard way. So that's not really on them so much. Also, they wrote a gem, they published it. That's really helpful. Would I still go down this path even though some of this gem just doesn't sit that nicely with me? Yes, I would still do it again. So I don't want perfection to get in the way of just shipping something. Also, I don't want to create my own gem to do this. Then I'd have to maintain it. They're doing those hard yards, so thank you to them. Okay, caching. I said I'd talk about this. Sessions don't work when you're redirecting. The sessions are done via cookies, and when you redirect, you're telling the browser to go somewhere else. So it's like, well, I don't care what cookies you're sending me because I'm actually sending you somewhere else. So you don't get that persistence of a session when you're sending people off to the IDP and when they come back. Which is why there's the relay state parameter, and also why when we've got this bridge logic, we need to cache those request details. I guess you could pass them in the relay state again, double passing, but it's a bit easier this way. So yeah, don't rely on a session if you're going to try something like this. I would use a cache. We use memcache with Rails standard cache stuff, and it's fine. Keep in mind, these are test environments. If it doesn't work, it's not the end of the world. Also, the odds of the cache overflowing in a test environment is pretty small. So low risk. The other thing is certificates. I mentioned that an IDP will have a certificate. Sometimes a service provider will also have a certificate if you want that double layer of security. This is all for signing and confirming messages that are being passed around. When I was working on this bridging code, I got a bit lost figuring out which certificate to use where. I found my way through, but it's more that if you're going to try something like this and you see messages saying, this SAML response doesn't look right, it's probably a certificate issue. So I would start there. I wish I could be more helpful, but at least I'm giving you a signpost of saying you probably want to go that way. Okay, so now I want to talk about automated tests. And the fact that a SAML flow, this kind of end-to-end thing, requires going to a third-party site. That's annoying because you can't really do that in an automated test sense. So writing a feature spec for that, yeah. So the most approachable option is to use request specs, and you cover it either end of the flow. You cover the sending out and you cover the coming back. Essentially, you cover the new action and you cover the create action of that first controller we looked at. So this is an example of how you might request spec that going out step. You want to make sure you got a redirect happening. You want to make sure you are sending a SAML request. You want to make sure you're sending a relay state. You probably want to actually check what the relay state is. I didn't bother putting that here because it's going to differ from app to app. And then you want to check that the URL minus the parameters, the query string, is actually what you would expect, what the IDP has told you. So that's kind of the core of it. You're confirming that you're sending people out to the right place with the right data. And then on the way back, it's a little less elegant because we've got to use a test double. Because creating your own SAML response object, which is XML. Yeah, I see at least one person shaking their head there. Yeah, exactly. It's no fun. Don't do it. Unless you really want to, I guess. But that's your call. No judgment. Yeah. So you would start what you'd expect of a response object and make sure it gets passed in. Then you just make a request. It doesn't matter what that SAML response string is because you're going to get that stubbed object instead. It doesn't need to be valid. It could be an empty string. It doesn't matter. And then really from that point, you're like, well, how do I know that the request has succeeded? Well, it's probably logged the person in and sent them somewhere. So as much as you can in this test, check that that's happened. So again, a lot of setup for kind of like a core thing, but yeah. But then, particularly after figuring out the bridging logic and kind of go, oh, I've got staging, acting as an IDP. So I've dealt with IDPs a bit. Okay. Could I make that work in a feature spec? Now, again, we don't want to rely on a third party for our tests, right? Because even if it works at all, it's going to be unreliable. You're relying on somebody else's code out there. That's no way for a good time. You should only test what you can control. But we could control a tiny little IDP that runs within our code, within our tests. So this, look, I know it's a lot of code. You don't need to read it. But it's kind of a rack handler that takes in a request and sends you straight back, actually. It generates that HTML again of a form that immediately submits. So this is an IDP that doesn't want you to enter in a username and password because there's no point. That logic is handled by the actual IDPs. You should not be writing tests for something that will never get run in your production app. So here we're just sending the user straight back. It's like, cool, you've hit the IDP. Here's a valid session. I'm not going to ask you to log in. And then we have, yes, this is actually using that. So we get a port number that isn't taken. And then we fire up our rack app, our tiny little rack app via Puma. And we do it in a silenced way, in a separate thread. If you're doing this for yourself, you probably want to actually have it not silent because you want to know if it's not working. But once you have it working well, definitely make it silent because it gets pretty noisy. And then in a test, we've got that rack app, that little IDP running in a thread for us. So we can, in a feature spec, we can go and click on that, sign in with your special SAML IDP thing, and it will hit that IDP mini service and come straight back with a valid identity. And then we can just say, okay, well, what would we expect to happen? Then let's run tests around that. It's like, should I see a welcome text? Should I see some indication that I'm signed in? Whatever that looks like in your app. And then at the end, make sure you shut down that IDP server in a separate thread. And if you just kill the thread because you've set it to silent, you won't get anything output in test, even if it's like, oh, you shouldn't stop this. It's like, it's fine, you can go. You've served your purpose. Thank you. So this is a nice little feature spec. That makes me happy. It's quite focused. I know there's a lot of code happening under the hood, but the fact that you can then write a feature spec like this, I like that. Makes me happy. One other thing I'm going to show you is just a bit of Ruby code that creates self-signed certificates. Comes in handy when you're doing all this testing because you need some certificates. Yeah, it doesn't matter that it's self-signed. As it turns out, a lot of IDPs, if not all IDPs, are using self-signed certificates. They're not reliant on a third-party authoritative source. Yeah, so this is kind of like what you'd expect in production as well. All right, I feel like it's kind of clear, and it's kind of performant, and it's definitely testable. Yeah, so as I said, I'm going to put these slides and code online as soon as I can, and hopefully write up some blog posts. I'll probably break down each of these ideas into a separate blog post. I know I've glossed over things, but I hope the core components there are understandable, and hopefully I haven't melted your brains. I was going to say, does anyone have any questions? A hand was already going up. Go for it. We have request specs for failure. We don't, I think at this point, because we were just like, oh, that's going to be too hard. We're not going to worry about full end-to-end. Yeah. So we didn't bother with the end-to-end tests at all. And then I just thought, oh, but maybe we could. So we definitely have failure cases in our request specs. Yeah. But we should also have at least one unhappy path in the feature specs. Yeah.
Sorry, perhaps you mentioned and I missed it, but
yeah.
You started saying that the motivation for all this was not to support the Federation SAML.
Yes.
Where is the code where you have added?
That's in a whole nother controller. That's a great question. I should put that together. It's not a lot of code. I say it's like, oh, they've got this whole protocol. It's like it's another excellent, like you send them off to another service, they come back with the entity ID, and then you look it up in the metadata file. That's essentially it. So it's not that hard. But yeah, that's probably worth putting in here somewhere. You're right. Yep.
I think providers, you mentioned you kind of support a lot of those.
Yes.
They have like specific things on each of those that you're able to test, or once you implement that, it works for most.
What we've done works for most. We did a lot of testing with one of the federations because they had a whole test set up that we could just go, okay, we can just do all our tests against that. Great, cool. But the rest are all like production only. So we've kind of got the flow of like, okay, we've got something working. But we often go back to our customers and say, we've done what we think is right. Can you please confirm? And sometimes we have to go, oh yeah, you need to tweak that, or we need to tweak that, or whatever. Yeah.
SAML, just to get a good grasp of what actually this looks for a user, and in your specific companies, like those are students, you mentioned universities or something.
Yes.
So what would be like the normal flow? Let's say I'm a student for a given university.
Yep.
And then
Right. So you would come to the Covenant's website. So it's particularly researchers who are using it. And you like, oh, cool, I've heard this thing, I want to give it a shot. You would go to the normal sign up form, and you can see username and password fields there because we still support that. But we also have a button, sign in with SSO. Now, if your institution has been configured to say you must use SSO, if you're using it on our license, you must use SSO, which is a fair request. Then even if you fill out the username and password, or if you're filling out the registration details with an email address for that institution, we'll say, no, you need to use SSO, please go over here, go through that. Or you can start straight from, yeah, I already know I want to use SSO. You click that button, you enter just your email address, because in our case, we need to look at the domain, go, oh, you're this customer, you're from this institution, go to this IDP.
Your university.
Exactly. Yeah. Nice. I think there's a question, but here.
The staging.example.com and the production.example.com. Yeah, one example.
Yeah.
Staging is the production one, so some people staging production ones with configured into the identity provider.
Yes, essentially. I mean, that's why we need to add the bridging, because the PR app URLs are always changing. And we didn't want to have to configure additional service providers in the IDP. Yeah. We're just like, let's just configure staging and bounce things through staging instead. Nick?
Somewhat related. So everything sort of flows through staging.
Mm.
If there's a bug or something and staging goes down,
Yeah.
would that essentially mean that all future PR test suites would fail as well because they would run into?
It's not the test suite, it's the manual testing. Yeah. Like if there was a problem with that flow, then yes, testing SSO in our PR apps manually would not work. And we'd probably be like, oh, we should fix that. And just to be clear, it's just a testing thing. In production, you're not going through the staging site, you're going direct. Yep.
Do existing IDPs provide authorization, or is it the SP's full responsibility to handle authorization?
Now you're testing my knowledge of the own terms of, so authorization as whether you can do things. Yes and no, it can sit on both sides. So certainly for functionality within our app, within Providence, we manage that. We don't have any expectation on the IDP to do that. But we've certainly found some IDPs, some institutions are complex, and they're like, we only want this subset of people. Now we could look at, currently we don't support that on our side. We're looking into whether we want to take on that complexity. But a lot of IDPs, you can configure that. You're like, here is a service that we have configured that we allow our people to go to, but only this subset of people can go to it. So it can happen on either side.
I think that answer. So based on IDPs, I work at the University of Melbourne and have worked in not SAML but OAuth side of things. And IDPs can implement backend directory services. For instance, for example, Active Directory, and in that you can request the various scopes that you can request, and one of them could be for this application, I want you to set up an Active Directory where only a limited subset of users are available, and add certain parameters to them. So you can get those scopes back once you authorize. Once you authenticate, you get.
Yeah.
Going to that.
Yeah.
Authenticate, you get for that user, you get the scope back, and anything that you've configured in the IDP, like restrictions and whatnot, you get that back. Because I've dealt with OAuth, you get the JSON back, and based on that, you can make your application respond according in terms of authorization. So you can configure the identity provider to have certain authorization related features. It varies.
Yeah, definitely.
No, I was asking because I don't know what's the best practice for it. We use SAML ourselves in our app, and we're on the app. And yeah, because we had a problem on our IDE, and we can't really log in.
Right.
That's our only way of.
Yeah.
And our authorization is being handled on the IDE as well.
Right.
Supports.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds like a fun time.
Please,
Yeah, well, it's like 1 month now.
from experience, you want less on the IDP side, more on your side.
Yeah.
Because you have more control. The problem with IDPs and take the University of Melbourne as an example, they're freaking pain in the butt. Every request you make, they go, can you fill this form? If you want to add this, can you fill the other form? And it's a long back and forth process dealing with your IDP and saying, you just providing your authentication, all right? Just deal with that. And authorization, I can either put in my own app or upload it to another microservice in my app. But yeah, I want IDP to do the least minimum work it is. Any change you make, you have to go back to them. Yeah. That's my 2 cents, sorry.
No, that's great. I appreciate the real world experience here. So that's really appreciated. Thank you. Yes.
When you did the switching with the XML parsers, did you find that the gem had a sufficient enough test suite to actually cover that? Or did you find yourself adding more?
So we didn't fork it. We just wrote our own parser that kind of leaned on some of the Ruby SAML logic. The code that I showed before, it parses the document with Nakagiri. It grabs just the bit it needs. It then creates that as a full XML document to then pass into the Ruby SAML gem because it wants to deal with things in a RexML way.
Oh, okay, so
Yeah.
it sits separately.
Yeah. Like there's definitely some tests there from what I can remember. But it was just kind of be like, oh, okay, I need to figure out not just changing the parsing, but changing the handling of the objects you get from the parsing. And I'm just like, that's more than I want to do.
How much were you able to optimize memory consumption?
Significantly, but I couldn't give you like we run Confidence on Heroku. I think we initially tried it on a standard 1 dyno. Didn't like that. Standard 2 dyno, and it was just like often like just going, whoa, no, too far, which is like twice the resources that it gives you by default. So now we have it running on a standard one because we have to request every single IDP we're dealing with, and every now and then that number grows, which is good for us. But yeah, so now I feel like it was taking maybe it wasn't the length of time, it was just the memory consumption more than anything else. Like it'd just be like, cool, grab just the IDPs we need. And it's like, yeah, there goes the memory and it's crashed and it will start again and it will crash and it will start again. These days it doesn't crash, I think, at all. And we've added more IDPs since we started. So yeah. So I think it's still on a standard 2 dyno on Heroku. But there's running our full Rails app context. So it's not just IDP parsing. Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, we store customer details in the database. So we're kind of like, okay, this is the logged in user from our perspective. Like we have our own ID locally. We connect that via email because we kind of need emails for how we work. This like tying into sessions from an IDP perspective, there's kind of a suggested practice, but not anything locked in. So an IDP can, when it sends you back the response, it can say, hey, you should really only log this user in for like an hour or a day or a week. Like it can specify the time frame. Whether the service providers actually pay attention to that, that's up to each service provider to be honest. Yeah. Any other questions? All right, we might leave it there then. Thanks, everyone.